He was a wanted man, looking for a way out. She was a mayor's wife, looking for a way to breathe. In the lawless canyons of Idaho, Silas and Cassidy found a connection that was never supposed to exist. But with a jealous tyrant and a dozen hired guns closing in, their love might just be their death warrant. You won't want to miss a single heartbeat of this journey to the Wyoming sky. Step into a world of dusty trails and deep emotions, where we explore Western romance, family loyalty, and the kindness that survives against all odds. Love isn't just a feeling. It's a commitment to stand in the line of fire for the person who, if this romance moved you, share the love. Like, comment your thoughts and subscribe to keep the spirit of the West alive.
The heat in Clearwater, Idaho didn't just sit on you, it owned you. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of alkaline dust and stagnant air that turned every breath into a chore. By noon, the sun was a white-hot coin hammered into a copper sky, mocking anyone foolish enough to move faster than a crawl. I stood on the porch of the Blackwood Mercantile, my fingers tracing the cold iron latch of my reticule. Inside that small silk bag sat 3 pages, thin, crinkled, and heavy as lead. They were pages torn from the back of Elias Blackwood's private ledger, the one he kept locked in the floorboard safe beneath our bed. Those pages contained names, dates, and the exact prices paid to the circuit judge and the territorial marshals to keep Clearwater orderly. To the world, I was Cassidy Thorne Blackwood, the quiet, auburn-haired bride who had the good fortune of marrying the wealthiest man in the valley. To Elias, I was a piece of fine porcelain, something to be displayed when he wanted to look respectable, and something to be cracked when he felt the world wasn't bowing low enough. "Afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood," a voice croaked. I looked down. Old Man Miller was sitting on a crate of dry goods, his skin like cured leather, his eyes clouded with cataracts. Beside him sat his granddaughter, Sarah, a slip of a girl no older than 7, her ribs visible through a threadbare cotton shift. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. Elias was inside the store discussing the price of cattle hide with the manager. He had cut off the Millers' credit a month ago because they couldn't pay the interest on a seed loan. He wanted their land, the small plot near the creek, and he was happy to starve a child to get it. I reached into my pocket. My hand trembled as I pulled out a small cloth pouch containing $2 silver and a handful of dried beef. It was a dangerous gesture. In Clearwater, charity without Elias's permission was considered an act of treason. "Take this, Sarah," I whispered, leaning down as if to adjust my boot. "Hide it. Tell no one." The girl's eyes widened, her small hand darting out like a bird to snatch the pouch. But before she could tuck it away, the heavy oak door of the mercantile swung open with a violent creak. The air seemed to freeze. Elias Blackwood stepped onto the porch. He was a man of sharp angles and expensive wool, his black coat spotless despite the dust. He had a face that women called handsome, until they looked into his eyes, gray, flat, and devoid of anything resembling a soul. He didn't look at the Millers. He looked at me. Then his gaze dropped to Sarah's hand, where the corner of my cloth pouch was still visible. "Cassidy," he said. His voice was a low, melodic purr that made the hair on my arm stand up. "What have I told you about the local strays? Feed a mangy dog and it only learns to beg louder." "They're hungry, Elias," I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes. I had learned that looking away only invited the switch. Elias smiled. It was a thin, predatory expression. He stepped forward, his polished boots clicking on the wooden slats. He didn't yell. He never yelled in public. Instead, he reached out and gripped my forearm. His thumb found the soft skin on the inside of my wrist and pressed down hard until the bone groaned. "You are my wife," he whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell the expensive tobacco and bourbon on his breath. My wealth is not yours to squander on failures. It is a matter of discipline. He turned his gaze to Sarah. Give it back, girl. Sarah whimpered, clutching the pouch to her chest. I said, Elias's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a cold, controlled rage. Give it back! He reached out to wrench it from her, his hand raised in a threat that everyone on Main Street knew he would carry out. The blacksmith stopped his hammer. The saloon doors ceased their swinging. The town of Clearwater held its breath, waiting for the inevitable crack of a hand against a child's face. I'd reckon the lady gave that freely. The voice cut through the heat like a blade of ice. It was steady, resonant, and carried the unmistakable cadence of a man who didn't care about the Blackwood name. Elias froze. He turned his head slowly, his grip on my wrist tightening until I saw spots. Standing in the middle of the dusty street was a stranger. He was tall, his frame draped in a duster the color of a storm cloud, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He wasn't wearing a lawman's tin star, but he carried himself with the heavy, quiet lethality of a loaded gun. His boots were caked in the red clay of the high desert, and a Winchester was slung casually over his shoulder. He stepped into the shade of the porch, his hazel eyes locking onto Elias's. He didn't look at me yet, but I felt the shift in the air. Move along, drifter, Elias spat, his face flushing crimson. This is a family matter, unless you want to spend the night in a cell that I own. The stranger tilted his hat back, revealing a face weathered by wind and sun, handsome in a rugged, scarred sort of way. He looked at Sarah, then at Elias's hand on my bruised wrist. I've spent nights in worse places than your cages, friend, the man said. He stepped up onto the porch, invading Elias's personal space. He was a head taller and twice as broad. But where I come from, a man who puts hands on a woman or a child in the street is called a coward, and cowards usually don't own much of anything once the sun goes down. Elias let go of my wrist. He lunged forward, his fist balled, aiming for the stranger's jaw. It was a clumsy move, the strike of a man used to people standing still while he hit them. The stranger didn't even flinch. He simply stepped to the side, caught Elias's arm, and used his own momentum to send him reeling. Elias stumbled, his boots sliding on the dusty wood until he crashed backward into the large communal water trough at the edge of the porch. Splash. The sound was glorious. The king of Clearwater went under, his expensive hat floating away, his black wool coat soaking up the murky, horse-spit-filled water. A collective gasp went up from the street, followed by a silence so thick you could hear the flies buzzing. Elias emerged sputtering, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face a mask of humiliated fury. "You!" Elias choked out, pointing a trembling finger. "You're a dead man!" The stranger didn't even look at him. He turned to me. For the first time, our eyes met. There was a depth in his gaze, a mixture of recognition and a sorrow that mirrored my own. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean handkerchief, and handed it to me. "Your wrist is bleeding, ma'am," he said softly. I looked down. Elias's ring had cut into my skin. I took the cloth, the warmth of his fingers lingering on the fabric. "Thank you," I whispered. It was the first time I had felt the truth of those words in 3 years. "Silas Vane," he said, tipped his hat to Sarah, and then looked back at Elias, who was being helped out of the trough by a shivering store clerk. "I'll be at the livery if you want to discuss discipline further, Blackwood." Silas turned and walked away, his spurs jingling a rhythmic, defiant tune against the silence of the town. Elias stood on the porch, dripping, his dignity in tatters. He looked at the crowd, his eyes promising 1,000 different retributions. "Get in the carriage, Cassidy," he hissed, his voice trembling with the effort to keep it low. "Now." I climbed into the black buggy, my fingers clutching the silk reticule. The 3 pages inside felt heavier now. The stranger, Silas, had done more than just humiliate my husband. He had punctured the illusion of Elias's invincibility. As we drove away, Elias staring straight ahead with a murderous intensity, I looked back at the clouds of dust kicked up by the carriage wheels. The game had changed. I wasn't just stealing pages anymore. I was looking for a way to burn the whole book down. And for the first time, I knew I didn't have to do it alone. Expanding a novella to this length requires deep internalizing, allowing the characters to breathe, describing the tension in the room, and building the slow burn romance that defines the genre. The Blackwood Manor sat on the highest hill in Clearwater, a Victorian monstrosity of white paint and green shutters that looked like a bleached skull overlooking a graveyard. Inside, the air was perpetually cold, even when the Idaho sun was trying to melt the rocks outside. Elias liked it that way. He said a man couldn't think if he was sweating. I sat at the vanity in our bedroom, staring at my reflection. The bruise on my wrist had already turned a sickly shade of plum. I wore a long-sleeved dress of heavy silk, high-collared to hide the tension in my throat. Elias stood behind me, his reflection hovering over mine like a ghost. He was drying his hair with a towel, having spent an hour scrubbing the scent of the water trough from his skin. He hadn't spoken since we left the mercantile. The silence was worse than the shouting. Silence meant he was calculating. "He's a bounty hunter," Elias said suddenly. His voice was conversational, which made my skin crawl. "Silas Vane. My clerk did some digging while I was bathing." I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the silver-handled brush in my hand. "A bounty hunter? In Clearwater?" "He claims to be drifting, but men like that don't drift without a scent." Elias stepped closer, placing his hands on my shoulders. His fingers were cold. "You seemed quite taken with his heroics, Cassidy. The way you looked at him. It was almost as if you expected him to carry you away on that dusty mare of his." I was startled, Elias. Nothing more. Startled? He leaned down, his lips brushing my ear. "You gave the Miller brat my money. You embarrassed me, and then you let a vagabond put his hands on me. Do you know what happens to things that don't function properly in my house, Cass?" He reached out and picked up a delicate porcelain figurine of a dancer from the vanity. He turned it over in his hands, then simply opened his fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor. "They get replaced," he whispered. "Go downstairs. I've invited the sheriff and Judge Higgins for dinner. You will play the happy wife. You will smile until your face aches. And if I see you look toward the livery stable even once, I will burn the Miller's cabin to the ground with them inside. Do you understand?" "Yes, Elias." Dinner was a slow-motion torture. I sat at the head of the table, moving peas around my plate while the men discussed territorial progress, which was just a fancy way of saying who they were going to swindle next. "Vane is a problem," Sheriff Daniels said, wiping grease from his mustache. "He's been asking questions at the saloon about the land grants from '78, specifically the ones involving the railroad spurs." Elias swirled his wine. "The spurs are legal, Sheriff. I have the papers to prove it." "He's looking for someone, Elias," Judge Higgins added, his voice thin and nervous. "He asked about a man named the Colonel, someone from the 5th Cavalry." I saw Elias's hand twitch. It was a tiny movement, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years studying his every tick. "There are no colonels in Clearwater," Elias said flatly. "Just us. Now, Cassidy, dear, why don't you tell the judge about the new rose bushes you're planting? It's much more pleasant than talk of drifters." I spoke. I smiled. I played the part. But inside, my mind was racing. The 5th Cavalry. I remembered a trunk in the attic, one Elias kept double-locked. I had seen an old blue tunic inside once, years ago, before he caught me and slapped me so hard I saw stars for a week. That night, after the men left and Elias fell into a heavy, bourbon-soaked sleep, I crept out of bed. My heart was a drum in my chest as I knelt by the loose floorboard under the heavy oak wardrobe. I pulled out the ledger pages I had stolen. They were cold against my palms. I needed to get them to Silas Vane. If he was looking for a colonel, and if Elias was that man, then Silas wasn't just a savior, he was a reckoning. I slipped out the back door, moving through the shadows of the rose bushes. The night air was crisp, smelling of sage and distant rain. I didn't take the carriage. I walked, staying off the main road, my boots sinking into the soft dust. The livery stable was a dark silhouette at the edge of town. The smell of hay and manure was a relief after the cloying scent of Elias's expensive cologne. "It's late for a lady to be out alone," a voice rumbled from the hayloft. I jumped, nearly dropping the silk bag. Silas Vane swung down from the loft with the grace of a mountain lion. He wasn't wearing his duster now, just a sweat-stained Henley and dark trousers. The moonlight caught the jagged scar on his forearm. "I'm not a lady," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm a Blackwood. Or so the law says." Silas stepped into a patch of moonlight. He looked at me, his gaze lingering on the high collar of my dress. He knew what I was hiding. "I heard about the dinner party," he said. "The sheriff doesn't keep a secret well after 3 whiskeys. Why are you here, Cassidy?" "You're looking for a colonel," I said, stepping closer. "From the 5th Cavalry, the one who disappeared after the skirmish at Bitter Creek." Silas went still. The air around him seemed to hum with a sudden, violent energy. "How do you know about Bitter Creek?" "Because my husband has nightmares about it," I whispered. I reached into my bag and pulled out the ledger pages. "And because he's been paying the judge and the sheriff to make sure no one from the War Department ever comes sniffing around Clearwater." Silas took the pages, his rough fingers brushing mine. He scanned them quickly, his jaw tightening. "This is blackmail," Silas said. "He's been taxing the town into poverty to fill a war chest. He's building an empire on graves, Mr. Vane. If you're here to kill him, do it. But if you're here for justice, you're going to need more than a gun. You're going to need the rest of this book." Silas looked up from the pages, his hazel eyes intense. "Why are you helping me? He's your husband. In this territory, his hanging would be your ruin." "I've been ruined since the day I said I do," I said, the words spilling out like a confession. "I don't want his money. I want to breathe without permission. I want to walk down a street and not feel like a piece of property." Silas stepped closer, so close I could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face, then hesitated. He tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind my ear, his touch so gentle it made my breath hitch. "I was in that unit," Silas whispered. "The colonel, your husband, he didn't just desert us. He took the payroll and locked the supply shed before he ran. He left 40 men to starve in a blizzard while the Sioux closed in. I'm the only one who made it out of the valley." "Then we're both survivors, Silas." "Go back," he said, his voice urgent. "If he wakes up and finds you gone, he'll kill you. I need you to get the rest of that ledger. The front half has the land deeds he stole. Without those, he's just a man with a gun. With them, he's the law." "I'll get them," I promised. "Cassidy," he called out as I turned to leave, "if things get bad, if he suspects, you find a way to get to the Broken Arrow Ranch. Don't wait for me. Just run." I nodded, disappearing into the dark. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a fuse, waiting for a spark. The following 3 days were a blur of calculated silence. Elias was working at the lumber mill, which meant he was likely overseeing the intimidation of more homesteaders. I spent my time in the house, a ghost in silk. I cleaned, I organized, and I watched. I learned the pattern of the house's breath, the way the floorboards groaned at 3 in the afternoon, the way the wind whistled through the attic vent. But Elias was changing. He had become hyper-focused. He stopped drinking his morning bourbon. He started carrying a small derringer in his waistcoat pocket. "You're very quiet lately, Cass," he said on Friday morning, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen. "Usually you're humming some morbid hymn. You haven't hummed in days." "I have a headache, Elias. The heat is getting to me." The heat. He walked over and took my chin in his hand, tilting my head back. He searched my eyes for a long time. I kept them blank. I had practiced in the mirror for hours. You've been going to the mercantile a lot. Mrs. Henderson says you've been asking about stationery. Do you have someone to write to in Ohio? I miss my mother. Is that a crime? In this house, having a heart that belongs to someone else is a grave offense. He let go of my chin with a sharp flick. I'm going to the ranch today. I'll be back late. Don't wait up. As soon as his horse's hooves faded down the drive, I moved. I didn't go for the safe under the bed. Silas had told me Elias was smart. A smart man keeps his secrets in two places. I went to the attic. The heat up there was unbearable, a physical weight that made my head throb. I found the trunk Silas had mentioned. It was tucked behind a stack of old carpets. The locks were heavy, but Elias was arrogant. He kept the keys in the pocket of his old dress coat, the one he wore for weddings and funerals. My hands shook as I turned the key. Click. The lid creaked open. Inside was the blue tunic, folded neatly. Beneath it lay a stack of papers tied with a black ribbon. These weren't ledger pages. These were letters. Letters from men Silas had mentioned, pleas for help, reports of missing payroll, and a map of the Bitter Creek Valley with a large X over a supply depot. But there was something else. A small, leather-bound journal. I opened it. It was Elias's diary from the war. October 14th, 1864. The blizzard is coming. The men are weak. If I take the gold now, I can be across the border before the first snow blocks the pass. They are dead anyway. Why let the gold die with them? I felt sick. The cold-bloodedness of it was written in his elegant, precise script. This was the blood debt Silas was hunting. I tucked the journal and the letters into my apron, my heart hammering. I needed to get out. Now. But as I turned to head down the narrow attic stairs, I heard the front door slam. "Cassidy!" Elias's voice roared through the house. He wasn't at the ranch. He had circled back. I panicked. I looked around the attic. There was no other way out except a small window that led to the steep roof. If I went down, he'd see the bulge in my apron. If I stayed, he'd find me here. "Cassidy, I know you're in here." His boots hit the stairs. Not the attic stairs, but the second-floor hall. He was checking the bedroom first. I scrambled to the window. It was stuck, painted shut by years of neglect. I grabbed a heavy iron bookend from a nearby crate and smashed the glass. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet house. "The attic," I heard him snarl. I climbed out onto the shingles. The sun blinded me, and the slope was terrifyingly steep. I crawled toward the back of the house where a trellis of heavy ivy climbed the stone chimney. My silk skirts were a hindrance, snagging on the wood. I ripped them, my legs scraping against the rough stone as I swung myself onto the trellis. I climbed down, my fingers bleeding, the adrenaline masking the pain. I hit the ground just as Elias's head appeared out of the broken attic window. "You bitch!" he screamed, his face contorted in a way I had never seen. "I'll kill you for this!" I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't head for the town. I headed for the woods. I knew the shortcut through the creek bed. If I could get to the Broken Arrow Ranch, if I could find Silas, I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. I could hear his horse behind me. Not his carriage horse, but his stallion, the fast one. He was coming for me, and he wasn't going to bring me home this time. I reached the edge of the ranch property, the white fence of the Broken Arrow appearing through the trees. "Silas!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Silas!" A figure emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. It was Silas. He saw me, disheveled, bleeding, my dress torn to ribbons, and he didn't ask questions. He ran. He caught me just as I collapsed, my knees hitting the dirt. "I have it," I wheezed, pulling the journal from my apron. "I have the proof." Silas took the book, his eyes wide. Then his gaze shifted to the road behind me. Elias rode over the crest of the hill, his horse lathered in foam, his revolver drawn. He skidded to a halt, the dust swirling around him like a shroud. "Give her to me, Vane," Elias shouted, his voice cracking with madness. "She's my wife. She belongs to me by law." Silas stepped in front of me, shielding me with his body. He leveled his Winchester at Elias's chest. "The law doesn't cover murder, Blackwood," Silas said, his voice like mountain stone. "And it sure as hell doesn't cover treason. I've waited 12 years to look you in the eye again. You're not taking her anywhere." "You think Thomas Raymond will protect you?" Elias laughed, a high, thin sound. "I own the sheriff. I'll have this whole ranch burned by morning." "Then we'll see who burns first," Silas replied. Elias looked at the Winchester, then at me. The hatred in his eyes was a physical weight. He knew he couldn't win a shootout with Silas Vane, not yet. "Keep her then," Elias spat, wheeling his horse around. "But remember this, Vane. Everything I own comes back to me eventually. And when I come for her, I won't be alone." He galloped away, leaving us in the settling dust. Silas turned to me, dropping the rifle. He pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in my life, I didn't pull away. I leaned into him, the scent of hay and honest sweat and safety washing over me. "You did it, Cass," he whispered into my hair. "You did it." "It's not over," I said, looking at the journal in his hand. "He's going to bring the whole town down on us." "Let them come," Silas said, his grip tightening. "I've survived a blizzard and a massacre. I can survive, Elias Blackwood. And so can you." I looked up at the vast Idaho sky, and for the first time the horizon didn't look like the bars of a cage. It looked like a promise. To maintain the cinematic pacing and the slow burn tension of a 30,000-word Western romance, these chapters focus on the shift from the domestic spy game to the high-stakes survival of the frontier. The Broken Arrow Ranch was not a palace, but to me it felt like a fortress. The main house was built of thick cedar logs and river stone, sitting nestled in a valley where the wind sang through the ponderosa pines. Thomas and Margaret Raymond had welcomed me with a silent, ironclad grace that spoke of 1,000 shared secrets. They didn't ask why the mayor's wife was bleeding and mud-stained. They simply handed me a cup of black coffee and a clean pair of trousers. But the peace was a lie. We all knew it. "He won't come alone next time," Thomas said, leaning against the kitchen hearth. He was cleaning a double-barreled shotgun, the rhythmic snick-slap of the metal echoing in the quiet room. "Elias has the regulators, those hired guns he brought in from Boise to protect the rail lines. They aren't lawmen. They're butchers in tin stars." I sat at the table, my fingers tracing the scarred wood. Silas was standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the fading twilight. He hadn't put his rifle down since we arrived. "He doesn't just want her back, Thomas," Silas said, his voice low. "He wants that journal. It's the only thing that can put him in a federal noose. As long as we have it, we're the target." "Then we move," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Silas, you said he has a safe, a real one, in the basement of the Mercantile." Silas turned, his hazel eyes narrowing. "The vault. He keeps the land deeds there, the original ones before he forged the signatures of the homesteaders." "If we're going to run," I continued, standing up, "we don't just run with a diary. We run with the keys to his kingdom. If I can get into that vault, I can get the deeds for the Millers, for the Hendersons, for everyone he's bled dry. We strip him of his land, and he has no power to call the sheriff." Silas stepped toward me, his expression a mix of admiration and fear. "Cass, that vault is in the heart of town. It's a suicide mission." He sighed. "He thinks I'm a broken bird hiding in your barn, Silas. He expects you to stay here and defend me. He won't expect me to walk right back into the lion's den while he's out scouring the hills for us." The plan was a dance on the edge of a razor. At midnight, under a moon shrouded by heavy clouds, we rode back toward Clearwater. I wasn't wearing silk anymore. I wore a pair of Silas's old buckskin trousers, a dark shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. My hair, once my pride and Elias's trophy, was tucked tightly away. We left the horses a mile out, near the dry creek bed. The town was eerily silent. the only light coming from the flickering amber glow of the saloon lanterns 3 blocks away. The mercantile sat like a dark monolith. Elias's office was in the back, accessible through a heavy cellar door that smelled of damp earth and rot. Silas jimmied the lock with a deftness that told me his bounty hunter skills included a few things the law wouldn't approve of. 10 minutes, Silas whispered, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. The heat of his palm through my shirt was the only thing keeping my knees from buckling. I'll be at the corner of the alley. If you hear a whistle, you drop everything and run for the back fence. I know, I breathed. I slipped inside. The cellar was a forest of crates, flour, salt pork, ammunition. I navigated by touch, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I found the stairs leading up to the small office. The room smelled of Elias, expensive paper, ink, and that cloying, suffocating bourbon. The vault was a massive iron box bolted into the stone wall. I knew the combination. Not because he told me, but because I had watched him through the crack in the door for a year. He used the dates of his military victories, dates that were actually massacres. October 14th, 64. The tumblers clicked. The sound felt loud enough to wake the dead. I pulled the heavy door open. Heavy door. Inside were stacks of gold coins, but I didn't care about the metal. I grabbed the leather satchel marked Clearwater Land and Cattle. I opened it, my eyes straining in the dark. There they were. The deeds, the miller's farm, the church's plot, my father's old surveying maps. I stuffed them into my shirt, the paper sharp against my skin. Suddenly, the floorboards above me groaned. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A light appeared under the door, a thin golden line of lantern light. I told you, Sheriff. Elias's voice drifted down, cold and sharp as a winter frost. She wouldn't stay at the ranch. She's too smart for that. She thinks like a scavenger. She'll come back for the things she thinks will buy her freedom. The door handle turned. I didn't have time to reach the cellar stairs. I ducked behind a heavy oak desk, pulling my knees to my chest. The door swung open. Elias stepped in, followed by Sheriff Daniels. Elias looked different. His eyes were wide, manic, lit by a fever I had never seen. He held a lantern in one hand and a heavy Colt in the other. He walked straight to the vault. He saw the open door. "She's been here," Elias whispered. He didn't scream. He sounded almost delighted. "She's here now. I can smell her perfume, rosewater and fear." He turned the lantern toward the desk. The light crawled across the floor, inches from my boots. Tweet. A sharp, low whistle echoed from the alleyway. "Vane," the sheriff grunted, drawing his weapon. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired a shot through the window toward the alley. "Go, get him. I'll handle the wife." As the sheriff ran out, Elias stepped toward the desk. I didn't wait for him to find me. I lunged from my hiding spot, throwing a heavy glass inkwell at his face. It caught him on the forehead, blue-black ink exploding across his pale skin like a brand. He roared, blinded for a second, and I bolted for the cellar door. I hit the stairs, tumbling down the last few steps, and burst into the cool night air. Silas was there, already swinging onto his horse, holding the reins of my mare. "Go! Go!" he yelled. Bullets bit into the wood of the mercantile behind us as we thundered out of town, the satchel of deeds heavy against my heart. We had the crown jewels, but we had just started a war. We rode until the horses' breaths were ragged sobs in the cold night air. We didn't head back to the Broken Arrow. We couldn't. Elias would burn that place to the ground if he thought we were there. "The high pass," Silas shouted over the wind. "If we can make it to the Bitterroot Range, there's an old mining camp. We can hold up there until dawn." The terrain shifted. The soft dust of the valley gave way to jagged shale and ancient twisted pines. The ascent was brutal. My legs ached, and the raw skin on my hands from the trellis climb screamed in protest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Behind us, a mile or more down the slope, we saw the flickering orange glow of torches. Elias wasn't giving up. He had his regulators, and they were riding fresh horses. "They're gaining," I said, looking back. Silas glanced at the torches, then at me. His face was a mask of grim determination. "They won't follow us into the Devil's Throat. It's too narrow for a group. We'll bottleneck them there." The Devil's Throat was a canyon so narrow 2 horses couldn't ride abreast. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, slick with moss and shadows. As we entered the mouth of the canyon, the moon finally broke through the clouds. It illuminated Silas's face, the sweat, the grit, and the raw, unadulterated protectiveness in his eyes. "Cass," he said, pulling his horse to a stop, "I need you to take the satchel and the journal. Keep going. There's a cabin 3 miles up, near the frozen spring. Hide the horses in the brush." "No," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm not leaving you. I'm not." "I'm not asking you to be a martyr," Silas said, stepping off his horse and pulling his Winchester from its scabbard. "I'm asking you to be the witness. If I don't make it, you take those deeds to the marshal in Boise. You tell them what happened at Bitter Creek. You finish this." He walked over to me, reaching up to take my hand. His touch was no longer hesitant. He pulled my hand to his lips, kissing my knuckles with a ferocity that made my heart ache. "I've spent my whole life running from that blizzard, Cass," he whispered. "Letting you go. That's the only thing that makes the rest of it worth it. Silas, please." "Go!" he roared, slapping my horse's flank. I bolted. The sound of his rifle echoed through the canyon seconds later, a sharp, rhythmic crack, crack, crack. I rode like a madwoman, the trees blurring into a dark, terrifying wall. The cabin appeared through the mist, a crumbling ruin of logs. I hid the horses, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I waited. 1 hour. 2. The silence was the worst thing I had ever endured. It was a physical weight pressing the air from my lungs. I clutched the journal and the deeds to my chest, my tears falling silently onto the leather. Then I heard it. The slow, rhythmic clop of a single horse. I pulled the derringer I had stolen from Elias's bedside table, my hands shaking. I stepped out into the moonlight. A horse emerged from the trees. Silas was slumped over the saddle, his duster soaked in something darker than the night. "Silas!" I ran to him, catching him as he slid from the horse. He was cold, his breath coming in shallow gasps. A bullet had caught him in the side, just above the hip. "Did you get them?" he wheezed, a weak smile touching his lips. "I have them. They're gone, Silas. You stopped them." "Not all of them," he whispered, looking toward the trail. "Elias, he's still coming. He's like a devil, Cass. You can't kill a devil with lead." I looked at Silas, the man who had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. I looked at the satchel of deeds that represented the freedom of an entire town. I realized then that Silas was wrong. You couldn't kill a devil with lead. You had to kill him with the truth. I hauled Silas into the cabin, stripping his shirt to staunch the bleeding with my own petticoats. As I worked, the moon reached its zenith. "We aren't running anymore," I whispered more to myself than to him. "Tomorrow, we stop being the hunted." I looked out the window at the long, dark trail. I knew Elias was out there. I could almost feel his hatred pulsing through the air. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the dark. In this installment of Dust and Redemption, we move into the quiet, agonizing intensity of the recovery arc. These chapters focus on the raw vulnerability between Cassidy and Silas, and the revelation of the past that binds them together. The cabin at the high pass was a skeleton of a home, a relic of the 1849 gold rush that had long since bled dry. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the cedar logs, a mournful sound that mimicked the whistling in Silas's lungs. I had hauled him inside, my muscles screaming, my vision tunneling with exhaustion. I laid him on a bed of dry pine needles and old burlap sacks. The smell of copper, thick, cloying blood, filled the small space. "Cass," he wheezed, his hand clutching his side. "The bag. Don't let it get wet." "Quiet, Silas," I snapped, though my voice was thick with tears. "The bag is safe. You aren't." I stripped his duster away. The wool was heavy, soaked through. Beneath it, his flannel shirt was a ruin of crimson. The bullet had entered just above his hip, a jagged, angry mouth that wept dark life onto the floor. I ripped my petticoat into strips, my teeth baring in a silent snarl of frustration. I needed fire, I needed iron. I worked in a fever. I gathered old, splintered wood from the corner of the cabin and struck a match with trembling fingers. The flame sputtered, then caught, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. I placed a rusted skinning knife I found on the mantel into the embers. I have to look," I whispered, kneeling beside him. "Do it," Silas groaned, his jaw clamped shut so tight I feared his teeth would shatter. I peeled the fabric away. The wound was shallow but messy. The lead was still in there, nestled against the bone. I had watched my father do this once, years ago, on a hound dog that had been caught by a stray Winchester round. I never thought I would be doing it to a man I didn't finish the thought. I couldn't. "This is going to hurt, Silas. More than the blizzard." "Nothing hurts more than the blizzard," he breathed, his eyes fluttering. I took the knife from the fire. The blade glowed a dull, vengeful orange. I poured the last of Silas's canteen over the wound to clear the grit. Then I pressed the hot iron to the flesh. The sound was a hiss, the sound of meat searing. Silas didn't scream. He arched his back, a guttural, animalistic sound tearing from his throat, his fingers digging into the dirt floor until his nails bled. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, making my stomach churn, but I didn't pull away. I used the tip of the knife to flick the lead out. It hit the floorboards with a dull clink. "It's out," I gasped, collapsing back against the wall. "It's out, Silas." He went limp, his head lolling to the side. For a terrifying minute, I thought he had stopped breathing. I crawled to him, pressing my ear to his chest. Thump, thump, thump. He was alive. I spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and washing the grime from his face. As the fever took hold of him, he began to mutter. He spoke of the Ghost Pass. He spoke of men named Miller and Vance, not the Miller from Clearwater, but others. Men who had died hungry. "Elias," he whispered, his hand reaching out in the dark. "You left the gate locked. The gold. You took the gold." I took his hand, lacing my fingers through his. His skin was burning, but his grip was iron. "I have the gold now, Silas," I whispered, thinking of the deeds in the satchel. "And I'm not leaving." As the first gray light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, the fever broke. Silas opened his eyes. They were clear, though clouded with pain. He looked at me, truly looked at me. And for the first time, he didn't see the mayor's wife. He saw Cassidy. "You're still here," he said, his voice a ghost of its former self. "I'm a Blackwood, remember?" I said, a bitter smile touching my lips. "We're hard to kill and even harder to get rid of." He reached out, his thumb brushing the soot on my cheek. "You're a thorn, Cassidy. Don't ever let that man's name pass your lips again." I leaned into his touch, the warmth of the fire at my back, and the cold reality of our situation in front of us. We were two broken things in a broken cabin. But as I looked at the Winchester leaning against the door, I realized we weren't just survivors anymore. We were the law. 3 days passed in a haze of mountain mist and wood smoke. Silas was mending, though he walked with a heavy limp and a grimace that he tried to hide from me. We lived on hardtack and the few squirrels Silas managed to shoot from the porch with his revolver. The satchel of deeds sat between us like an altar. "We can't stay here forever," I said on the 4th morning. I was sharpening the skinning knife, the rhythmic shur of stone on steel, the only music we had. "Elias will have the pass watched. He knows I can't ride back to town, and he knows I won't leave you." Silas was sitting on a crate cleaning his rifle. He paused, his gaze fixed on the valley below. There's a junction 10 miles north, the Judas Gate. It's an old trading post. A man named Holloway runs it. He owed my father a life. If we can get there, we can get fresh horses and a head start to Boise." "The Judas Gate," I repeated. "Why do they call it that?" "Because it's where the trails cross, and most people choose the wrong one," Silas said grimly. As we packed our meager supplies, I found the federal warrant in Silas's saddlebags. I had seen it before, but I hadn't read the fine print. Warrant for arrest, Silas Vane. Charge, desertion and theft of union payroll. Bitter Creek, 1864. My heart plummeted. I looked at Silas, who was cinching the saddle on my mare. "Silas," I said, my voice trembling, "this warrant, it says you stole the gold." Silas froze. He didn't turn around. His shoulders slumped, a weight settling on him that had nothing to do with his wound. "I didn't take it," he said, his voice flat. "Elias was the commanding officer. He ordered me to lead a scout party into the blizzard to clear a path. When we got back, the supply shed was empty. The gold was gone, and Elias had vanished. He left a note in the ledger, the one I saw in your house, claiming I had led a mutiny and fled with the chest." "But you stayed," I said. "You stayed with the men." "I stayed until the last one stopped breathing," Silas said, finally turning to face me. His eyes were red-rimmed, full of a decade of haunting. "I walked out of that valley with nothing but my rifle and the names of 40 dead men burned into my brain. I've been a ghost ever since, Cassidy. A ghost looking for a man who died and became a king. If we go to the marshals," I realized, the horror dawning on me, "you'll be arrested, even with the deeds, even with the journal. It's your word against a man who built Clearwater." "It doesn't matter," Silas said, stepping closer. He took my face in his hands, his touch rough and honest. "As long as you're safe. As long as those deeds get to the families. I'll hang if I have to, Cass, just to know he didn't win." "No," I snarled, a fire erupting in my chest. "No one is hanging, not you, not today." We rode out an hour later. The descent was treacherous, the horses picking their way through loose shale. We stayed off the main trails, moving like shadows through the pines. The Judas Gate appeared as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. It was a sprawling, ramshackle building of unpainted wood surrounded by a high picket fence. A single lantern hung over the door, swinging in the wind. A man stepped out onto the porch as we approached. He was thin, with a long gray beard and eyes that twitched with a nervous energy. "Silas," the man called out, his voice thin. "Silas Vane, is that you?" "It's me, Holloway," Silas said, dismounting with a pained grunt. "We need horses, fast ones, and some grain, and some—" Holloway looked at me, then at the heavy satchel tied to my saddle. He licked his lips. "I heard news from Clearwater, Silas. They say you kidnapped the mayor's wife. Say there's $1,000 on your head, dead or alive." "You know me better than that, Holloway," Silas said, his hand resting on his holster. I do," Holloway said quickly, waving us inside. "Come in. Get out of the cold. I'll have my boy fetch the horses." The inside of the post was cluttered with traps, pelts, and dry goods. It smelled of wood smoke and something sour, something like betrayal. "Sit, sit," Holloway urged, gesturing to a table. "I'll get some stew." I didn't sit. I walked to the window, pulling back the heavy burlap curtain. The trail we had just come down was empty, but then I saw it. A flash of light, a reflection of the setting sun on a brass telescope. "Silas," I whispered. Before I could finish, the back door of the post slammed open. 3 men stepped in, their revolvers drawn. They weren't lawmen. They were the regulators. And standing behind them, his face still stained with the blue-black ink of my inkwell, was Elias Blackwood. "Twice, Silas," Elias said, his voice a purr of pure malice. "You've crossed me twice. There won't be a third." Silas went for his gun, but Holloway, the man who owed his father a life, stepped behind him and pressed a double-barreled shotgun to the back of Silas's head. "I'm sorry, Silas," Holloway whimpered. He's got my boy. He's got my boy in the cellar. Elias walked toward me, his boots clicking on the floorboards. He looked at the satchel on the table, then at me. He reached out, his hand hovering over my cheek, and I spat in his face. He didn't flinch. He wiped the spit away with a silk handkerchief. "You've grown claws, Cassidy," Elias said, his eyes dark with a terrifying obsession. "I think I'll enjoy breaking them, one by one." He turned to his men. "Take the drifter to the barn. I want him to watch while I burn that satchel. And then we'll see how much a bounty hunter is worth when he's screaming." As they dragged Silas out, he looked at me one last time. He didn't look afraid. He looked at me with a silent command. "Finish it." The Judas Gate had lived up to its name. We had chosen the wrong trail, and now the devil was at the door. In Chapter 8, we reached the dark night of the soul. The romantic tension is stripped raw by the threat of imminent death, and Cassidy must transition from a fugitive to a combatant. The air in the Judas Gate trading post was thick with the smell of old grease and the metallic tang of betrayal. Holloway wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards, his shotgun trembling against the back of Silas's skull. "I'm sorry, Silas," Holloway whimpered again, his voice a pathetic reed. "He's got my boy. Blackwood's men. They put a knife to little Billy's throat." "What was I supposed to do?" Silas didn't move. He didn't plead. He stood like a statue carved from mountain granite, his gaze fixed on me. "You did what you had to, Holloway," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Now put the gun down before you trip and hurt yourself." Elias stepped forward, his polished boots clicking a rhythmic death knell. He reached out and snatched the leather satchel of deeds from the table. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the original land grants. A slow, serpentine smile spread across his face. The ink stain on his forehead had faded to a bruised purple, making him look like a demon rising from a shallow grave. "Everything in its place," Elias purred. He looked at me, his gray eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy. "Did you really think a few stolen pages and a drifter with a tragic past could topple me, Cassidy? I am the foundation of this territory. I am the bricks, the mortar, and the law." "You're a thief and a coward, Elias," I spat, my voice echoing in the rafters. "And every man in this room knows it, even the ones you pay." Elias's smile didn't falter, but his hand lashed out, striking me across the face. The world tilted. I hit the floor, the copper taste of blood filling my mouth. "Take Vane to the barn," Elias commanded his regulators. "Tie him to the center post. I want him to watch while I burn these deeds. And then, I think we'll see if a hero screams the same as a traitor." Two burly men, their faces hidden behind thick beards and layers of trail dust, grabbed Silas by the arms. They dragged him toward the back door. He didn't struggle, not because he had given up, but because he was waiting. As he passed me, his eyes burned into mine. Stay alive. Find the opening. I was hauled up by my hair and shoved into a small, windowless storage room off the main hall. Elias slammed the heavy oak door and turned the iron bolt. "Wait there, my dear," he called through the wood. "Once I've settled my debt with the Colonel's ghost, we'll discuss your penance. I'm thinking a long, quiet life in the cellar, far away from the sun." The silence that followed was worse than the violence. I sat in the dark, surrounded by the smell of dried herbs and salted pork. My cheek throbbed and my soul felt like it was being crushed by a mountain of iron. I looked at my hands. They were covered in Silas's dried blood from the cabin. "I am a thorn," I whispered to the dark. "I am a thorn, and I am not done." I began to feel along the walls. This wasn't just a storage room. It was a larder built into the side of the hill. The back wall was made of stacked river stones, cool and damp. I felt a gap, a place where the mortar had crumbled over decades of frost. I reached into my boot. The skinning knife I had sharpened in the cabin was still there. I began to dig. Every scrape of steel against stone felt like a thunderclap. I worked with a frantic, bleeding intensity. Outside, I could hear the muffled sounds of Elias's voice, the cruel, rhythmic cadence of a man enjoying his work. Then, a sound that made my heart stop. The crack of a whip. I didn't scream. I dug faster. The stones shifted. One, the size of a loaf of bread, tumbled outward into the dirt. A sliver of moonlight spilled in. I clawed at the earth, my fingernails tearing, until the hole was wide enough for my shoulders. I squeezed through, the jagged rocks tearing at my shirt, and tumbled into the cold night air behind the trading post. The barn was 50 yards away, its double doors thrown wide. A bonfire had been lit in the center of the yard. Elias stood by the flames, the satchel of deeds in one hand and a torch in the other. Silas was lashed to the main support beam of the barn, his shirt torn away, his back a map of fresh agony. But his head was up. He was staring Elias down, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a groan. "The miller's farm," Elias said, tossing the first deed into the fire. The paper curled and blackened in an instant. "The Henderson Ranch. All gone, Silas. All back to me." I moved through the shadows of the picket fence. I needed a weapon. My skinning knife wouldn't reach from here. I saw the horses, Elias's stallion and the regulator's mounts, tied to the rail near the well. And there, tucked into the scabbard of a buckskin mare, was a long-barreled Remington. I crept toward the horses. The wind was blowing toward the barn, carrying the scent of the fire and the horses' nervous sweat. I reached the rail, my hand closing around the cold steel of the rifle. It was heavy, balanced, perfect. I looked at the barn again. Elias was reaching for the last bundle, the journal, Silas's proof, my freedom. "This is the end of the story, Vane," Elias shouted over the roar of the flames. "The traitor dies in the dirt, and the hero goes home to his wife." I raised the Remington. I didn't have Silas's years of training, but I had a father who had taught me that a rifle was just an extension of your intent. I breathed out, the cold air steadying my heart. I didn't aim for Elias's head. I wasn't ready for that yet. I aimed for the rope holding the heavy iron pulley above the barn doors. Crack. The rifle kicked against my shoulder. The rope snapped. The massive iron hook used for hoisting hay bales swung down like a pendulum of God's own wrath. It caught the lead regulator across the chest, sending him flying into the watering trough. "What the—" Elias spun around, dropping the journal. I didn't wait. I fired again, this time hitting the kerosene lantern hanging from the barn eaves. It exploded in a shower of liquid fire, drenching the dry straw near the entrance. "Cassidy!" Silas roared. In the confusion of smoke and flame, I ran. I didn't run away. I ran toward the barn. I swung the Remington like a club, catching the second regulator across the knees. He went down with a howl. I reached Silas. My knife was out in a heartbeat, slicing through the hemp ropes. He fell into my arms, his weight nearly taking us both down. "The journal," Silas wheezed, his eyes searching the dirt. "I've got you," I said. "Forget the book." "No." He gripped my arm. "The book is the only way you stay free." Elias was screaming orders, his face a mask of ink and soot. He reached into the fire, trying to save the satchel, his own hand catching flame. He howled in pain, retreating as the barn began to roar with fire. I saw the journal. It had rolled near a pile of burning hay. I lunged for it, the heat searing the hair on my arms. My fingers closed around the leather cover just as the roof of the barn groaned. "Cass, get out!" Silas shouted. He grabbed me by the waist and threw us both through the side door just as the center beam collapsed in a fountain of sparks. We hit the dirt, rolling into the tall grass. Behind us, the Judas gate was a pillar of fire. The horses had broken their tethers and were scattering into the woods. I looked at the journal in my hand. It was scorched, the edges curled, but it was whole. I looked at Silas. He was covered in soot, bleeding and exhausted, but he was looking at me like I was the sun rising over the bitter roots. "You came back," he whispered. "I told you," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and triumph. "I'm a thorn. We don't leave our own behind." The regulators were shouting in the dark, trying to round up the horses. Elias's voice was a jagged shard of glass, screaming my name into the night. He was still alive, he was still hunting. But as Silas and I disappeared into the shadows of the pines, I knew the power had shifted. Elias had the land, but I had the truth. And in the West, truth was the only thing that ever truly drew blood. This is the final descent into the Valley of Shadows, and the ascent into the light. These chapters conclude the saga of dust and redemption. The town of Oakhaven was a skeleton bleaching in the sun. 20 years ago, it had been a silver camp. Now, it was a collection of sagging porches and sightless windows, abandoned when the veins ran dry. We had reached it on foot, limping through the high sagebrush, Silas leaning heavily on my shoulder. "He's behind us, Cass," Silas wheezed, his face gray with exhaustion. "I can feel the heat of him." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was lined with the bitter dust of the trail. I helped him into the ruins of the old livery stable, the only building with a roof that didn't look ready to cave in. I laid him in the shadows behind a stack of rotting timber. "Stay here," I whispered. I pulled the Remington rifle, the one I'd taken from the Judas gate, to my shoulder. "I'm going to the bell tower." "Cassidy." Silas reached for my hand, his grip weak but desperate. "If he gets past me, run. Don't look back." "Don't." "He isn't getting past anyone today, Silas." I leaned down and kissed his forehead. It tasted of salt and wood smoke. "I'm my father's daughter. It's time I acted like it." I climbed the rickety stairs of the abandoned church across the street. Every step groaned, a treacherous sound in the unnatural silence of the ghost town. The bell tower was a cage of splintered wood, offering a panoramic view of the single dusty street below. I lay prone on the floorboards, the barrel of the Remington resting on the sill. I breathed, slowly, in and out, just like my father had taught me before Elias Blackwood bought my life. "The wind is your heartbeat, girl. Don't fight it. Ride it." A mile away, a plume of dust rose. 3 riders. Elias was in the center, his black coat flared behind him like a crow's wings. He wasn't hiding. He was arrogant. He thought he was coming to collect a runaway pet. They entered the town at a slow walk. The rhythmic clop-clop of the horses' hooves echoed off the empty storefronts. Elias stopped his stallion in the center of the square, right in front of the livery. "Cassidy," he roared. His voice was jagged, stripped of its melodic polish. "I know you're in there with your dying hound. Bring me the journal, and I might let him bleed out in peace. Keep me waiting, and I'll hang him from the rafters while you watch." The regulators began to spread out, their revolvers drawn. One headed toward the livery. The other started toward the church. My finger tightened on the trigger. I didn't aim for Elias, not yet. I needed to take his teeth away first. The regulator near the church stepped onto the porch. Crack. The Remington kicked. The man spun, his shoulder exploding in a spray of red, and he tumbled back into the dust, howling. "Sniper!" Elias screamed, diving off his horse and rolling behind a heavy stone trough. The second regulator fired blindly at the bell tower. Bullets shredded the wood around my head, splinters stinging my cheeks. I didn't flinch. I shifted my aim. I saw the flash of a muzzle in a window across the street. The second man had moved into the saloon. I waited for him to lean out for a better angle. There. Crack. The man's rifle clattered to the boardwalk. He didn't make a sound as he slumped over the railing. Now it was just the devil in me. "You can't hit me, Cassidy," Elias shouted from behind the trough. "You haven't the stomach for it. You're a housewife. You're my property." "I am a thorn," I yelled back, my voice echoing through the hollow town. "And the only thing you own is the dirt you're hiding in." Elias lunged from behind the trough, sprinting for the livery stable. He knew Silas was in there. He wanted a hostage. I fired, the bullet kicking up dust inches from his heels. He ducked into the doorway. I abandoned the tower, sliding down the stairs and sprinting across the street. My heart was a war drum. I burst into the livery just as Elias was standing over Silas. His derringer pressed to Silas's temple. Elias's face was a mask of soot and ink, his eyes wide with a manic, flickering light. "Drop it," he hissed. "Drop the rifle, or I blow his brains into the hay." I lowered the Remington, but I didn't drop it. "It's over, Elias," I said, stepping into the dim light. "The journal is with the Millers. I sent Sarah's father to the marshal 3 hours ago. Even if you kill us, the world knows who you are. The colonel is dead." Elias's hand trembled. The lie, the beautiful golden lie of his life, was shattering. "I built that town. I made them. They are nothing without me." "They are free without you," I said. Silas moved. It was a blur of emotion, a desperate, pained lunge. He grabbed Elias's wrist, forcing the derringer upward. Bang! The shot went into the rafters. I didn't hesitate. I didn't aim with my eye, I aimed with my soul. I fired the Remington from the hip. The heavy slug caught Elias square in the chest, the force of it throwing him backward into a pile of old tack and rusted chains. Silence returned to Oakhaven. I ran to Silas, pulling him into my arms. He was gasping, his wound reopened, but he was alive. We looked over at Elias. He lay still, his eyes fixed on the hole in the roof, the blood pooling beneath his black coat. The king was just a man, and the man was gone. "Is it done?" Silas whispered. I pulled the scorched journal from my shirt and laid it on his chest. "It's done, Silas. The ghosts can sleep now." The ride to Laramie took 2 weeks. We moved slowly, stopping at small ranches where the people were kind, and the law was a distant secondary thought. By the time we reached the border, the autumn air had turned sharp and sweet, smelling of the first frost and the promise of snow. The federal marshals had met us in Boise. The journal, combined with the land deeds and Silas's testimony, had been enough. Elias Blackwood's empire was being dismantled piece by piece. The town of Clearwater was recovering. The Millers had their land back, and the sheriff was sitting in the very cell he used to lock others in. Silas had been granted a full pardon for his desertion. The truth of Bitter Creek finally etched into the official records of the War Department. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man with a name. We stood on a ridge overlooking a vast golden valley in Wyoming. Behind us, the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots were tipped with white. In front of us, the horizon stretched forever. An ocean of grass under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "Thomas said the ranch is 3 miles further," Silas said, leaning against his horse. He looked healthy now. The color had returned to his face, though he still walked with a slight limp that he wore like a badge of honor. "The soil is good, plenty of water." I looked at him. He wasn't the drifting bounty hunter I'd met in the dust of Clearwater. He was something else now, my partner, my equal. "And no blackwood trees?" I asked, a playful smile touching my lips. Silas laughed, a deep, warm sound that made the birds in the brush take flight. "Not a single one, Cass. Just pine, cedar, and as much open space as you can stand." He walked over to me, taking my hands in his. His palms were rough, calloused from a life of hardship, but they held mine with a tenderness that still made my breath hitch. "You saved me, Cassidy," he whispered. "Not just in the barn. Not just in the town. You saved the part of me that forgot how to hope." "We saved each other, Silas," I said. I reached up, tracing the line of his jaw. "I spent my life waiting for a hero to come riding into town. I didn't realize the hero was the woman I was hiding inside." "She's a hell of a woman," Silas grinned. "I'm just glad she decided to keep me around." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple gold band. Not the heavy, ornate diamonds Elias had used to chain me, but a plain circle of honest metal. "It's not much," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shy. "But it's mine, bought with my own wages. No blood on it. No secrets." I took the ring, the gold warm against my skin. I didn't need a ceremony. I didn't need a priest. The mountains were our witnesses, and the wind was our choir. "Yes," I whispered. He slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. We mounted our horses and turned them toward the valley. As we rode, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the very last page of Elias's ledger, the one that had started it all. I tore it into 100 tiny pieces and let the Wyoming wind carry them away. I didn't look back at the trail behind us. There was nothing left in the shadows of Idaho but dust and memories. Ahead, the sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in shades of violet, gold, and crimson. It was the same colors as my bruises once were, but now they were just the colors of a new day. We rode toward the cabin by the creek, toward the life we had earned with iron and embers. I was Cassidy Thorne no longer, and I was certainly no Blackwood. I was a woman of the West, free as the hawk circling above, heading home for the very first time. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.